Margaret Whitmore froze in the living room doorway. What she saw made her heart stop. Grace Thompson, the black maid she had hired 6 months ago to take care of the house, was in the backyard of the Long Island mansion. And she wasn't just cleaning. She was teaching Margaret's father, William Whitmore, diagnosed with advanced Alzheimer's 2 years ago, how to defend himself. The 78-year-old's trembling fists were raised. His body, normally hunched and confused, moved with something Margaret hadn't seen in years: purpose. And worst of all, he was laughing. That deep, genuine laugh she thought she had lost forever when the disease took him. Margaret Whitmore didn't know what shocked her more: the fact that her father with Alzheimer's was throwing punches in the air, or that he was doing so under the supervision of someone she barely trusted to iron her clothes. The $12 million Whitmore mansion gleamed in the September sun like a fortress of marble and glass. Built with tech money, Margaret had sold her startup for $2.3 billion at age 39. The property screamed success. But to Margaret, success meant control, order, structure. And what was happening in the backyard was the opposite of control. She had come home early. A board meeting had been cancelled. She hadn't told anyone. She liked to catch the staff off guard, to see how things really worked when they weren't being watched. That's when she heard it. Laughter. In the garden. Margaret walked quietly to the French window and peered through the white linen curtain. Grace, tall, dark-skinned, her hair in long braids, was crouched on the grass in front of William. Her hands gently guided his arms through slow circular movements. Both were barefoot. Strong arms, Mr. William. Feel your center. You are still here. You are still present, Grace instructed in a firm but gentle voice. Margaret felt something rise in her throat. Anger? Fear? Confusion? Grace should be folding sheets, organizing the pantry, keeping the house running. Not teaching her father, a man who didn't remember his own name most days, how to fight. It seemed dangerous. Inappropriate. A clear violation of boundaries. She was about to walk out the door and interrupt everything when William lost his balance, fell backward onto the grass, and burst out laughing. The kind of laughter Margaret hadn't heard since before the diagnosis. Pure. Complete. Present. Grace laughed too. No pity, just genuine pride. She helped him up. You're going to fall a lot, Mr. William. But every time you get up, you'll be stronger. And maybe even a little more dangerous. Like an old ninja. William asked, smiling broadly. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. He had formed a complete sentence. Coherent. With humor. With life. When was the last time that happened? When was the last time she saw him so present, so connected to the moment? But still, what was that? Manipulation? Some kind of strange game? Grace was crossing a clear line, and Margaret wasn't going to let it slide. She slowly backed away, invisible, climbed the Italian marble stairs, locked herself in the master suite, and stared at her own hands for almost an hour. Her hands that had built an empire. Her hands that had signed checks for the best specialists. Her hands that couldn't reach her own father. Something was out of place. And she was going to find out exactly what it was. Grace Thompson never really belonged in that house. Everything was too white. Not just the walls, the energy. Polished voices, tight smiles, cold air. The kind of house that looked clean even when it was empty of life. She knew her place. She knew how people saw her. The help. The maid. The one who came in the back door even when the front door was open. The invisible one. But Grace wasn't built to fade away. In the small maid's room in the garage annex, the walls told a different story. Stuck on photos of a smiling woman hugging an older man in military uniform. A framed, cracked certificate for self-defense instructor. A worn red sash hanging on a nail. And in the corner, a shoebox full of letters she no longer needed to read because they lived in her. Before this house, Grace had been an occupational therapist at a senior center in the Bronx. She loved the work. But it was when she began volunteering to teach self-defense to seniors with dementia that she found her true purpose. She had a father, James Thompson, a Vietnam veteran, diagnosed with Alzheimer's at age 68. Grace made a promise. Her father would never be weak. He would never be pitted. He would know how to stand up, fight if necessary. He would maintain his dignity until the end. And he fought. For years. Until the healthcare system, bureaucracy, costs, neglect, swallowed him up. He died at age 72 in a state nursing home where Grace couldn't afford better care. Alone. Confused. Calling her name while she was working 3 jobs trying to raise money to get him out of there. Without dignity. Grace stopped working with the elderly for a while. She stopped living, really. But bills had to be paid. Life doesn't pause for grief. She took what she could get, cleaning jobs, temp work, until she landed here, in this cold mansion where an elderly man wandered silently through polished hallways, disappearing a little more each day. William Whitmore. Grace didn't just see his Alzheimer's. She saw his fear. His silence. The way he cringed when he couldn't remember words. The shame in his eyes when he confused people. And she couldn't ignore it. So she started slowly. Gentle conversations. Sound recognition games. Simple body movements. Then light martial arts exercises. Nonviolence. Awareness. Trust. Presence. The man needed power. Grace knew what happened when the world thought you were weak. She knew what happened when you started to believe it yourself. She never asked for permission. But she never meant any harm. It wasn't about fighting. It was about surviving. It was about remembering that you still exist. That afternoon, after the session in the garden, Grace took off her shoes and went to her room. Her hands still remembered the feel of William's grip. Uncertain but determined. Shaky but present. She looked at the photo of her father in the window. Impeccable military uniform, proud smile, clear eyes. Before the disease stole everything. "You saw that, didn't you, Dad?" she whispered to the photo. "He's still in there. Just like you were." She didn't know that upstairs Margaret was already making calls. And within 24 hours, someone would start digging into the past that Grace had fought so hard to bury. Margaret Whitmore didn't sleep that night. She sat in the navy blue velvet armchair in the bedroom, an untouched glass of $1,000 Cabernet Sauvignon in, staring at the phone as if it could offer answers. But it didn't. Only more questions that tormented her. Why was that woman teaching her father to fight? Why was he so comfortable with her? Why did he laugh with her in a way he no longer laughed with his own daughter? And the worst question of all, why hadn't Margaret noticed any of this before? She always noticed everything. The weekly medical reports, the occupational therapy sessions, the nutritionist's detailed notes, the medication adjustments. Every detail of William's life passed through her. Or at least that's what she thought. But this, somehow Grace had connected with William in a way Margaret hadn't been able to in years. And that disturbed her deeply. It wasn't just jealousy. It was something more visceral. Fear that she was failing at the one job that really mattered. The next morning, Margaret didn't confront Grace. She didn't mention the scene in the backyard. She simply observed. Silently. Methodically. As she did in business meetings when she suspected someone was hiding something. She saw Grace walk by with a basket of laundry. She saw William follow her down the hall, tapping his cane rhythmically on the floor, smiling, talking about the weather, about the birds he had heard at the window. Margaret's stomach churned with something she couldn't name. She opened her $15,000 MacBook Pro laptop and typed slowly, deliberately, Grace Thompson, Bronx, New York. Not much came up. No criminal record, no pending lawsuits, no obvious red flags. Just a few outdated social media profiles showing a younger woman smiling at community events. Old school records. An expired occupational therapist license. Nothing concrete. Nothing that explained why this woman was in her house transforming her father. But Margaret had resources most people would never have. She picked up the phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in a while, a private investigator named Derek Stone who had handled delicate situations for her company in the past. Employee screenings, fraud investigations, things that needed to stay off the books. "I want a full background check," she said without preamble. "Complete work history, family ties, educational records, financial history, everything. Discreetly." "Are you looking for dirt?" Derek asked casually, as if inquiring about the weather. Margaret's voice was ice. "If there's dirt, I'm going to find it. And if there's a reason to fire her, I want to know before she gives me one." "Understood. 48 hours. 24, Margaret corrected. "This is a priority." Meanwhile, Grace felt it. The energy in the house had changed like the pressure shift before a storm. Margaret's words were colder. Her greetings, curt. No more polite nods as she passed. No more good morning, Grace with that performatively gentle tone. Just looks. Tight, piercing looks that Grace recognized from other jobs, other houses, other wealthy white women who began to see her as a threat rather than useful furniture. Grace had seen this before. The silence before the storm. The kind of quiet that came before women like her were let go. No real explanation, no concrete reason. Just the silent but clear signal, you don't belong here. You've crossed invisible lines that we never explained, but you should have known. That night, Grace sat in the backyard on the same patch of grass where she had once taught William to feel the earth beneath him, to be present in his own body. She considered quitting. Leaving before she was pushed. Before the humiliation of being escorted out with her few possessions in a cardboard box. But then William appeared at the glass door, tapping his cane until he found his way. Grace. His voice was uncertain in the darkness. She turned, startled. Hey, Mr. William. You should be in bed. It's past 9. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you said today, about falling and getting back up again. About how every fall teaches us something if we pay attention. She smiled gently, even though she knew he couldn't see it. Yeah. What about it? He hesitated, finding words. Have you ever fallen? In life, I mean. Not just physically. The question hit her like a whisper with the weight of lead. She nodded slowly, then remembered she needed to speak. More times than I can count, Mr. William. But each time you got back up? Sometimes for myself. Sometimes because someone needed me to keep standing. And sometimes, her voice faltered slightly, sometimes because not doing so would mean they won. William smiled in the darkness. You're strong. Stronger than most people I know. I want to be like that. I want that when I fall, when I forget where I am or who I am, I still remember how to get up. Grace looked away, blinking rapidly against unexpected tears. As he turned and slowly made his way back inside, counting his steps under his breath as she had taught him, Grace realized she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not when something inside William was finally waking up after years of slumber. But across town, in a windowless office in Manhattan, investigator Derek Stone had just uncovered the first piece of the puzzle. Hospital records. Death certificates. Newspaper articles about a veteran neglected to death in a state home. And Margaret Whitmore was about to learn that Grace Thompson had more than just secrets. She had a story that explained everything. And would change everything. William was changing in ways that couldn't be measured on medical charts or clinical reports. His steps, once hesitant and shuffling, now had rhythm and purpose. He didn't wait for instructions or permission. He traced the walls with his fingers, counted his steps aloud, recognized smells. Coffee in the kitchen, lavender in the hallway, Margaret's specific perfume as she passed by. It was as if he had finally given himself permission to exist rather than just survive. His doctors noticed it too. During his weekly appointment with Dr. Patel, the neurologist was visibly surprised. He's significantly more engaged during cognitive exercises. He answered before I even finished the question. His reaction time has improved by 40%. He even made a joke to the nurse about his ninja moves, the first time he's shown spontaneous humor in 8 months. Dr. Patel looked at Margaret over his glasses. What has changed at home? New medication? Different therapy? Margaret hesitated. Nothing official. But she knew exactly what had changed. And the root of it had long braids and was named Grace. That night at dinner, Margaret watched William manipulate his fork with more coordination, make jokes about the food trying to run away from him, engage in real conversation rather than monosyllabic responses. His joy filled the room like sunlight through a window that had been closed and covered for years. Dad, Margaret asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Have you been enjoying yourself with Grace? He nodded enthusiastically. Maggie, she's amazing. She teaches me things no one else thinks I can learn. Margaret cut the meat on her plate methodically. Like what, exactly? He thought, chewing. She taught me to listen with my whole body, not just my ears. To feel vibrations in the floor when someone approaches. To know where I am in space even when I can't remember the name of the room. He smiled with genuine pride. She taught me that my brain can forget things, but my body still knows. I'm still myself, even when I can't remember who I am. Margaret felt something tighten painfully in her throat. She wanted to smile back, to be purely happy for him, to share his joy without complication. But inside, jealousy gnawed at her like acid. Or maybe it was fear that her father was being molded, transformed by another woman. That someone else had given him something fundamental that she, with all her billions and resources, had failed to do. The next morning, at precisely 7:43 a.m., her phone rang. Derek Stone. I have what you asked for. Margaret closed her office door. Speak. Grace Thompson, age 43. Formerly a licensed occupational therapist working at the Bronx Care Center. Lost her license not for misconduct, but for failing to renew, financial issues. She had a father, James Robert Thompson, decorated Vietnam veteran, Bronze Star. Diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 68. Grace cared for him alone for 4 years while working full-time. Margaret gripped the phone tighter. Go on. James died at age 72 in a state long-term care facility. Official cause of death, pneumonia. But there's a local newspaper article that tells a different story: systemic neglect, understaffing, patient left in unsanitary conditions. Grace tried to get him out of there, but she didn't have the money. She was working 3 jobs trying to raise funds when he died. Heavy silence. There's more. She had a volunteer program before all this, teaching body awareness and basic self-defense to seniors with dementia and other cognitive impairments. Apparently quite successful until she had to stop after her father died. Financial and emotional collapse. Want the complete file sent? I have copies of death certificates, articles, hospital records, photos. Margaret's voice didn't come out right on the first try. Then swallowing, yes. Everything. Printed. Delivered discreetly. She hung up and stood at the office's panoramic window, looking out at the garden where Grace was hanging white sheets on the clothesline. The October breeze gently moved her braids. She hummed something softly, something that sounded like a gospel hymn. Margaret felt something crack inside her. Not a small crack. A fundamental break. Grace wasn't projecting trauma in a pathological way, as Margaret had assumed. She wasn't replacing a lost child or living in fantasy. She was trying to save Margaret's father in the way she hadn't been able to save her own. She was giving William the dignity, the purpose, the presence that the system had denied James Thompson. And Margaret had investigated her like a criminal. Like a threat. Like something to be eliminated. The manila envelope arrived 2 hours later by private courier. Margaret locked the office door and spread the contents on the $20,000 mahogany desk. Photos of James Thompson in military uniform, proud and strong. Then later photos, the decline visible. Newspaper articles with headlines that made her feel nauseous. Veteran dies in state home after allegations of negligence. Medical records showing Grace's pleas for better care, all denied for insurance and bureaucratic reasons. And one photo that made Margaret stop completely. Grace young, maybe 25, hugging James at some military event. Both smiling. Both whole. Before the disease took everything. Margaret closed her eyes. That afternoon, Grace was in the kitchen making chamomile tea when Margaret appeared. No warning. No sound of footsteps. We need to talk. Grace turned, already knowing. Already feeling. She said nothing, just waited, her hands resting calmly on the marble counter. Margaret placed the manila envelope on the kitchen island between them. About why you didn't tell me. Grace looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was inside. Her hands didn't shake, not from surprise, but from weary recognition. Of course. Of course she investigated. Why didn't I tell you what? Grace asked, her voice calm but with an edge of steel underneath. About your father. About what you did before you worked here. About everything. About why you're really doing this. Grace took a deep, long breath from her diaphragm, as she had taught in her old classes. Because in houses like this, even the truth is turned into something threatening. Into ammunition. Into grounds for dismissal. Margaret's voice was sharp as a scalpel. "You're projecting your trauma onto my father. You're turning him into some kind of warrior when he doesn't need it. When this isn't about him. It's about you trying to save someone you've already lost." Grace didn't back down. She didn't lower her eyes. "He's not yours to protect forever either. Not the way you're doing it." The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to have physical substance, filling the space between them like toxic fog. "You think you're teaching him to fight?" Margaret continued, her voice rising slightly. "You're turning him into something he's not. He's an elderly man with advanced Alzheimer's, not a." The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to have physical substance, filling the space between them like toxic fog. "Do you think you're teaching him to fight?" Margaret continued, her voice rising slightly. "You're turning him into something he's not. He's an elderly man with advanced Alzheimer's, not a soldier." Grace stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "I'm teaching him to exist. To feel his strength. To take up space in a world that tries to shrink people like him. Do you think I'm teaching violence? I'm teaching survival. Presence. Dignity." Margaret clenched her jaw. "You have no right to be his mother. You have no right to decide what he needs." "I don't want to be his mother," Grace replied, each word deliberate. "But someone needed to see him. Really see him. Not as a disease. Not as a responsibility. As a person who is still here." The words cut through the air like broken glass. "Leave," Margaret said, her voice trembling. Grace didn't move. "When Mr. William tells me to go, I'll go. But not before." They stood there, eyes locked. Two women, two wounds, two kinds of love colliding in impossible territory. In the days that followed, the house was glacial. Grace returned to her routine, quiet, precise, invisible again. Margaret returned to her formal, professional, distant tone. But beneath the surface, something was cracking in both of them. And William felt it all. He didn't need perfect memory to sense when the people he loved were at war. "Mom," he asked gently one morning as they had breakfast together, "did you and Grace have a fight?" Margaret paused, cup halfway to her lips. "She crossed boundaries, dear." "What does that mean?" "She did things I didn't ask her to do. Things that weren't her responsibility." He sat silently, stirring the coffee he wouldn't drink. Then he asked, "But don't people sometimes have to step out of line to help someone?" Margaret had no answer. That evening, while Grace was organizing the pantry, someone knocked softly on the back door of the kitchen. It was Rosa Medina, one of the gardeners, a young Latina who rarely spoke more than hello and goodbye. "Hey, sorry to bother you," Rosa said shyly. "I just wanted to say that I've seen how you are with Mr. William. The way he trusts you. My grandfather had dementia when I was little. I wish so much he'd had someone like you. Someone who made him feel strong instead of broken." She paused, her eyes shining. "So, thank you for doing that for him." Grace froze. Speechless. Just a slow nod. A small, painful smile. Eyes filling. Because even if Margaret questioned her intentions, even if she investigated her as a criminal, even if she treated her as a threat, the house, the people in it, were beginning to feel the change she had created. And the truth, once buried under layers of class and race and power, was beginning to rise to the surface. Across the property, Margaret sat alone in her office, looking at the photos scattered on the desk. James Thompson in uniform. Grace, young and hopeful. The articles about negligence and death. And for the first time in years, Margaret Whitmore, billionaire who built an empire on her own, who never cried in business meetings, who fired CEOs without batting an eye, cried. Because she had been wrong. Completely, fundamentally wrong. And she didn't know how to fix it. Thursday arrived with heavy skies. Dark clouds hung over Long Island like an omen. Margaret had left early for a meeting in the city, something about a trust fund, something legal she couldn't focus on. Back at the mansion, Grace was folding bedding in the guest room. William was in the living room, headphones on, listening to an audiobook about World War II. His stuffed guide dog sat on his lap. The sun filtered through the window, creating golden patterns on the Persian rug. The doorbell rang. Grace wasn't expecting anyone. She walked to the door, keeping the security chain on, and opened it just a crack. "Can I help you?" A man stood there. Tall, gray sweatshirt, Yankees cap pulled low. Obviously fake, patchy beard. Something about his eyes was wrong. Too alert, too focused. Delivery for Margaret Whitmore. She's not here. You can leave it at the front gate. He paused, looking past her into the house. It's personal. I need to deliver it by hand. Come back later. Grace started to close the door. He pushed it hard. The chain broke with a metallic snap. He came in. Grace backed away, her heart racing but her mind becoming clear, cold. Old training coming back. Where's the safe? There is no safe, she said, her voice calm despite her pounding pulse. That's a lie. I know there's money here. You have 5 seconds. Then, eyes narrowing, or I'll start with the old man. Everything stopped. The world became very quiet. Grace took a deep breath, long, full from her core, drawing from something deeper than fear. He doesn't know anything. Leave him out of this. Too late. He started down the hallway toward the living room. That was it. Grace moved fast. She grabbed his jacket, pulled him back hard. He spun around, shoving her violently against the wall. Pain exploded in her shoulder. But she was up in seconds, planting her feet. Mr. William, she shouted. Do what I taught you. Now. From the living room, William took off his headphones. His body froze. Then, muscle memory taking over, he straightened up. He stood still, listening, feeling vibrations. Grace circled the intruder, drawing him away from William. Want something? Come and get it. He lunged forward, fast. But his foot caught on the Persian rug that was slightly folded, something William had accidentally dislodged during balance exercises that morning. The man stumbled. Grace didn't hesitate. She hit his throat with her elbow, a precise strike she had learned decades ago. He choked, fell to his knees. She grabbed a heavy bronze table lamp, raised it above her head. He raised his hands. Okay. I give up. Grace let him crawl to the door, stumbling. As soon as he was out, she locked it and ran to William. He was standing, shaking but standing. Defensive posture still maintained. Police, she said into the phone, her voice surprisingly steady. Home invasion. 47 Harborview Drive. While she waited, she sat on the floor, pulled William down, held him as they both trembled. You were so brave, she whispered. I just remembered what you said. About feeling the floor. About being present. That was all. That was everything, she corrected, tears finally coming. Hours later, Margaret arrived to flashing red and blue lights, police cars, yellow tape. Her heart stopped. She ran inside. She saw Grace, her shoulder bandaged by a paramedic, sitting in the kitchen giving a statement. She saw William on the couch, covered with a blanket, holding hot chocolate, talking to a kind officer. Both alive. Both safe. Because of Grace. Margaret walked slowly toward Grace. She knelt in front of her, a billionaire on her knees before a maid. You saved him, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. Grace just nodded, too tired for words. I'm sorry, Margaret said. For everything. For investigating you. For accusing you. For not trusting you. For not seeing. Grace looked into her eyes. She saw something broken there. Something finally honest. He's safe, Grace said simply. That's what matters. That night, after the police left, after William finally fell asleep, Margaret sat with Grace in the kitchen. I won't accept your resignation, Margaret said. I didn't offer one. Good. Because I have a different proposal. Margaret slid papers across the table. I want you to run a program. Body awareness training for seniors with dementia. Here, using our property. Full salary, benefits, complete autonomy. And I want to fund research on it. Real study. Grace looked at the papers, then at Margaret. Why? Because you were right. About everything. And because, Margaret's voice broke, because if you'd had the resources you deserved, your father would still be alive. And I have resources. It's time to use them right. Grace didn't respond immediately. Then, I accept. But on one condition. What? You participate too. Learn the exercises. Do them with him. Not as an observer. As a participant. Margaret swallowed. Then she nodded. 3 months later, William presented at a community conference on Alzheimer's. He didn't speak, but he demonstrated exercises with grace. His confidence, his presence, inspired the entire room. Margaret watched from behind the scenes, finally understanding, strength doesn't come from control. It comes from trusting people who see what you can't. And sometimes, the person who saves your family isn't who you expected. It's the person you almost fired.